So thank you everyone for coming along, and again, huge apologies for the technical glitch. I'm here to welcome you all and thank you for your time, and thank you for being so patient in that lobby there. This is the ECOWind Policy Masterclass series. Today you're going to be hearing about the English Seabird Conservation and Recovery Pathway. So I'm Henk van Rijn. I'm a Research Impact Manager at Howe Marine Consulting, where I work at the Science Policy Interface as a Programme Champion for the ECOWind, EcoFlow and Insight environmental research programmes. Now, today's webinar is a special edition in which we have invited two guest speakers to walk us through some of the challenges around seabird conservation in the UK, but they will also be sharing with us some of their awareness of exciting new plans that are underway to protect and promote recovery of our most important seabird populations. Alex and Francis will tell you a lot more, but as you probably know, seabirds are really important predators in our marine ecosystems. They move significant amounts of energy around the ecosystem and sometimes over vast distances. They structure underlying prey populations on which they rely, but their diversity and their distribution also serves as an indicator of ecosystem health. So there are many important aspects to seabirds and their ecology that are being discussed at the moment in and around offshore marine artificial structures, such as wind turbines. They're a key component of a lot of environmental research that's being carried out at the moment. So it's a real treat today to have Alex and Francis on board. And yeah, part of the delay is because we had a technical glitch in getting permissions there and so on. So, again, apologies there. Just before we move on, I wanted to just mention that some of the other episodes we've had in the Policy Masterclass series, we've already covered quite a wide range of topics so far, ranging from strategic compensation, cumulative effects assessments, marine monitoring, 5 capitals, marine management, and our last one was on fisheries policy and management. Now, in case you wanted to catch up on any of those, you can go to the ECOWind YouTube site, which is where those all are. This QR code on your screen should take you there as well. You can find these on the ECOWind website as well. So after today's webinar, we've just got one more session in the series that will be on the 15th of October, where Audrey Jones, Principal Consultant at Howe Marine Consulting, she will present the latest progress in the development of marine net gain, which I'm sure a lot of you will be really interested in. It's a hot topic at the moment. So please do tune in for the last one in the series. So I'll get us back on topic here. We're here today to hear about the English Seabird Conservation Recovery Pathway. You'll hear from Alex Banks, who will run through a talk on the topic and bring us up to speed. I'll go through Alex's slides, and Alex is going to next slide me as we go through it. Okay. Alex is a principal specialist for ornithology with Natural England. His role encompasses aspects of bird conservation with a focus on evidence and advice. So Alex is also working at the Science Policy Interface. He's worked on offshore wind for over 20 years now, so a huge amount of experience there. And it all began with the Greater Gabbard Environmental Impact Assessment when you're employed, Alex, by the British Trust for Ornithology. You currently oversee Natural England's marine ornithology work, and that's really broad. It's across casework, monitoring, protected sites, and species recovery. So welcome, Alex. Following Alex's talk, we have around 30 minutes to discuss what's in the talk through a panel discussion, and that'll be with Alex, but also our other guest speaker, Francis Daunt. Now, you might have met Francis through other ECOWind work. Francis is a research group leader at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. he's been undertaking research on drivers for change in UK seabird populations for over 25 years now, and has, and is leading a long-term study of seabird populations on the Isle of May, just southeast Scotland. He's undertaken a number of projects on the effects of offshore renewable developments on seabirds, and he's currently the principal investigator of the ECOWind project, which is one of the projects funded under the ECOWind program. So we're really fortunate to be joined by Alex and Francis today, and it's a great opportunity to ask them questions about the English seabird conservation and recovery pathway, but also the other work that they're involved with. Bearing in mind, Alex's work is focused in England, and Francis's work is focused in Scotland. So quite a breadth there. So please do submit any of your questions that you have today. There should be a Q&A tab at the top or the bottom of your screens. We can run through these over the after the talk. So without further ado, now I am going to bring up Alex's talk, and we will start going through that. So
you'll be delighted to know there's loads of animations in it, I think, as well.
Sure, they'll work just fine, Alex. Yeah. Sort of. Let me first get that up, okay, and it's not connected. There you go. That's connected now. So can you see that, Alex?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, we're all good.
Okay, great. Over to you then.
Thanks, Hank, and thanks everybody for your time today. Yeah, I'm speaking to you here from Natural England's office in Exeter, in Devon, near where I live, and I'm going to talk about the English Seabird Conservation Recovery Pathway, which I'll refer to as ESCARP, because it's a bit of a mouthful. For those of you not familiar with Natural England, we're the statutory advisor on nature conservation in England, which means we provide advice to government, industry and the public on nature conservation, including in development planning. And just for full disclosure, although this is a policy masterclass, this isn't a policy. It's a set of recommendations that Natural England has written. But anyway, nonetheless, hopefully there'll be something of interest in it for you. It is just relating to England, as Hank says, and the other statutory agencies are preparing their own strategies. No doubt there'll be some overlap, but bear in mind it's just for England. So seabirds, to set the scene, probably as most people are familiar, mainly the news isn't that good, unfortunately. So in the UK, we have globally important populations of seabirds, and in England specifically, we have often substantial proportions of some of those seabirds, and they tend not to be doing so well. So if you just click on one, Hank, we'll see that hopefully an animation graph of shag trends in England. So we've got about 10% of the UK's shags, they're down 36% over the last 25 years. Kittiwakes, if you click on again, Hank, you'll see trends are also in decline. In England, over the last 25 years, the decline has been less steep, so only about 4% over the last 25 years, but prior to that, a decline of 42% since the late 80s and early 90s, which is when many of our protected sites were classified. So an ongoing picture of decline there. Little terns, the soft coast is really important in England. We have about 70% of the UK's little terns, and they're down 32% over the last 25 years and 50% over the last 35 years. So tends to be patterns of decline, both at a national scale and at individual sites. So this is the trend for lesser black-backed gull at Walney within the Morecambe Bay and Duddon Estuary SPA nearly to the point of collapse. That isn't uncommon in our protected sites, but in other parts of the country, species like lesser black-backed gull can be doing quite well, particularly in towns and cities. So there's a pattern of general decline. We do have populations that are increasing. So this is roseate tern. If you click again, Hank, this has necessitated really intensive conservation action from the RSPB at Cocoa Island, which is England's only breeding colony for roseate terns. And even with all that effort, the population is still fairly small at around 120 pairs, and that was before the effects of avian influenza. And then the final graph you can see there is for razorbill and guillemot on Lundy in the Bristol Channel. So a bigger rat eradication program on that island in the early part of this century has led to really encouraging responses in both of those species, and they've increased again since the last point on this graph, which was 7 years ago. But they're still nowhere near they would have been where they would have been historically. So we've got, fragile populations and declining trends. Next slide, please, Hank. And we know, we understand some of the pressures that are acting upon these seabird populations. Some of it obviously relates to food, and it was really encouraging to see DEFRA announcing the closure of the sand eel fishery in the North Sea, which will hopefully benefit seabirds, but also have benefits for the wider marine ecosystem and some of the other marine predators that rely on those fish species as prey. But it's not just about the abundance of prey. We know the availability of prey can be important, and under climate change, we obviously see more storms occurring, particularly over winter, and that can have big effects on seabirds and their food intake, which can both have direct mortality and implications for their breeding condition in the following breeding season. And then over the last couple of years, we've seen this big outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, which has had a big toll on many seabird populations and kind of underlined the fact that many of them are not that resilient to this kind of unexpected shock. And then finally, we've got pressures from development. As we all know, there can be potential impacts on seabirds from the development of things like offshore wind farms, which just means we have to be much more careful about where we place them and how we bring about mitigation where we can't avoid effects. If you click again, please, Hank, what this adds up to, unfortunately, is, as I said, not a great picture. A couple of weeks ago, there was an update to the Birds of Conservation Concern by RSPB and plus the statutory bodies. And the headline message from that is, of the 28 species assessed in the UK, unfortunately, 92% of those are either red or amber. So yes, seabirds not doing well generally. Next slide, please, Hank. And it was partly in recognition of this under the last administration that DEFRA commissioned Natural England to do a big piece of work to assess all of the evidence that we could find to try and really understand drivers of seabird decline in England. And having done that big evidence review, to formulate recommendations that could bring about recovery in those populations. And that's what became this piece of work known as ESCARP. Had various name changes, but that's what we ended up with. Click again, please, Hank, and then I think once more. So yes, it was a big piece of work that took a couple of years. It involved lots of people within Natural England, so not just the ornithologists, but specialists from other sectors as well, like fisheries and wildlife health, recreation, pollution, all sorts of things. We also had really good support from DEFRA themselves, as well as colleagues at JNCC, and RSPB made a big contribution to one of the pieces of work, which I'll describe in a minute. Next slide, please. And again, so the way that we approached this was to, as I said, collate the evidence and formulate what we're calling vulnerability assessments, which I'll explain in a bit more detail. Click again, please, Hank. We also assessed the adequacy of existing measures. So where we've already got conservation actions in place, we assess these against some of the vulnerabilities to see to what extent they address the problems. And the next slide. Then finally, underpinning all of this was a consideration of climate change. So a big review of the implications of climate change for the recommendations that we were making, so that all of them have that kind of ability to be flexible in response to changes from changing climate. Next slide, please. And one more. So this is how we formulated the vulnerability assessments in the marine environment. So there's two different types, marine and terrestrial. Go through them separately. We start with an activity. So an activity is usually a human activity. That could be the construction of wind farms. It could be fishing. It could be anything that happens in the marine environment. And click again, please. That generates a pressure. So as in this case, the pressure is a potential collision with a bird and a constructed wind farm turbine. And again, please, Hank. And then we consider the behavior of the animal. So how do they respond to the pressures that are presented from the activities? And one more click, that gives us the sensitivity. So that's one component of the vulnerability assessment. How sensitive is the bird to the pressure that results from the activity? And again, then we explore what we understand about where the birds are. So we drew in as much data as we could on bird distribution at sea. Click again, please, Hank. We then mapped the pressures as we understood them, and one more time. And that gives us obviously the interaction between, so it's a spatial interaction between the location of the birds and the location of the pressures. One more click, that gives us the exposure. So we've got these two metrics effectively within the vulnerability assessment, how sensitive the bird is and how exposed it is to the pressure. Next slide. And again, so that gives us a matrix where we bring these two metrics together, and you can see up in the top left where you've got high exposure and high sensitivity. These are obviously the biggest concerns, and as you move through that matrix, they become less of a concern. And it was the combinations that fell into moderate and high categories that we took further for consideration, and the ones that were low or not vulnerable, we screened out. Next slide, please. So in doing this vulnerability assessment, we looked at 36 species. So it's not just true seabirds. We did include things like sea ducks, divers and grebes, as well as the common seabird families that occur in England. And it is species that occur on passage, for example, and don't breed here as well, including some of the skuas. We looked at 60 different activities, as some of them I've already mentioned. And from those 60 activities, we were able to identify 25 different pressures, things like visual disturbance, collision, removal of food, etc. And as I mentioned, it was a really big piece of work, and we had over 2 million data points, mostly spatial data describing bird distribution and activity. So yeah, really data-driven approach to what we're trying to do. Lots of organizations contributed to that, and we're really grateful to all of them for their help in underpinning the work that we did. Next slide, please. So this is the other side of the vulnerability assessment, what we did on land at the breeding colonies. And it had these three strands. So in that box there, you can see Lock Review. That's named after Lee Lock, who led the work, Lee at RSPB. And this involved bringing together information on pressures that were known or thought to affect breeding colonies. So it was a big data exercise in data gathering from people like site managers to understand which pressures were relevant. We also looked at site improvement plans, which were plans formed under a life project called IPENS that aimed to look at all of the key pressures across special protection areas and special areas of conservation in England. And finally, we looked at our own sensitivity assessments and an updated sensitivity assessment to understand which pressures, again, on land that seabirds are particularly sensitive to. All of that was combined into this expert judgment exercise, and effectively a binary output from that process. Either the vulnerability was considered low, in which case it was screened out, or it was considered high, in which case it was taken forward. If you do a couple of clicks, Hank, I think there's some animations I forgot about, just to illustrate those points. And then the next slide. Okay, so this is how we brought it all together. So you can see at the top, the two different vulnerability assessments, the marine one on the left and the land-based colony one on the right. And you can see that it's either the high vulnerabilities or the top ranked pressures in the marine exercise that we took forward to the next tier. In that tier, we assessed the adequacy of existing measures, and where that was considered sufficient, we didn't take them further. Where that was considered insufficient, we did. This is the point at which we brought in the climate change considerations, and that all fed into the recommendations that ultimately we put together. Next slide, please. So we ended up with 19 different recommendations. And within those recommendations, which are quite high level, we've got 74 different actions that, if taken, combine to delivery of the recommendation. And it was possible to combine those recommendations into 4 different categories. So there are 4 clicks here, Hank, if you do them one at a time. First was feeding. This was obviously recommendations relating to food availability and abundance. Next was breeding. How many times have I said this? I still can't remember it. Breeding, relating to obviously those activities that relate to what happens at the colonies themselves and how we can address those. Then surviving. This is about how we can ensure greater survival in seabirds wherever they might be. And then finally, we had a set of recommendations relating to knowledge. So I don't really go into the knowledge recommendations within this presentation, but at the end, I'll show you the whole report. If you're interested, you can delve into it and see what we say about knowledge gaps. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just give a bit of a flavour as to what's in each of the recommendations. But as I say, if you want to see the whole report, you can look at the actions in more detail. There's obviously not time to really go into them in that detail today. But one of the key ones is about the development of a forage fish policy or something similar that brings about an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And some of the actions involve things like setting reference points for predators. So how much food do they need within an ecosystem so that the consideration of quota and maximum sustainable yield brings in the needs of predators as well as the needs of humans. We also have recommendations relating to the protection, conservation and restoration of marine habitats that benefit seabirds. Some of this is about MPA management, so about how protected sites are managed to benefit seabirds. Some of it is about the wider environment and how we deliver things like good environmental status under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the UK Marine Strategy. And that includes things like, because our definition of seabirds included sea ducks, how do we set about making sure there's enough benthic prey, for example, for species like eiders, which are depleted in parts of England. Next slide, please. The breeding recommendations. One of them relates to habitat again, so the conservation, restoration and creation of habitats at colonies. And this is probably particularly relevant to soft coasts. So obviously there are cliffs in England around the southwest and in the northeast, but we've got a hell of a lot of soft coast in between, so sand and gravel and all the rest of it. And there are opportunities here to manage things differently, but also to create new habitats potentially. The second recommendation is about management, and it has a particular focus on things like disturbance and predation, and how we might be able to reduce the pressures from those factors at specific breeding colonies. When we were compiling the ESCARP, I think bird flu or avian influenza rather was just kicking off in seabird colonies. So we go into it in terms of a recommendation, but there's probably a lot more we could have said about it if we'd written it a year later. But what we do describe is the need to reduce the emergence, spread, and impacts of pathogens and parasites. So some of that is about understanding how disease spreads and how we might mitigate it, as well as improving resilience at colonies when these outbreaks do happen. And that some of that is about how we as humans respond to those sort of outbreaks. And then the final one, I mentioned rat eradication. Sorry, Hank, just go back one more. Yes, okay, there's one more box on there. The final breeding recommendation relates to the eradication of mammalian predators. So we've seen at places like Lundy and a couple of the Isles of Scilly really encouraging responses in seabird populations following the eradication of rats. And this recommendation is about further expansion of that programme to more of the islands and smaller rocky islets that have potential as seabird colonies in England. And the flip side of that is biosecurity, obviously. So that's part of that recommendation. Thanks, Hank. Next slide. Okay, so on to the surviving recommendations. Some of this is about bycatch. So we obviously know that's a pressure that affects seabirds, and the recommendation revolves around both the monitoring of bycatch to understand it and also further attempts to try and mitigate the impacts of bycatch in specific fisheries. There's a recommendation relating to development, and it's really about strengthening the mitigation hierarchy so that we have truly sustainable development that considers the needs of seabirds right up front. And there's lots of actions in there that we're currently working on to try and help deliver that recommendation. We included a recommendation on marine litter. As we know, seabirds, particularly petrels and shearwaters, fulmars, can be can eat a lot of marine litter effectively. When you analyze their stomach contents, you get very high incidences of marine plastic in particular, and that can have both direct and, well, both lethal and sublethal effects on the birds that are eating that litter. So that's obviously a bit of a wider ecosystem challenge anyway, but with a specific seabird focus. And likewise, we made a recommendation about moving further towards good environmental status for contaminants and trying to reduce the impacts on seabirds of some of them. So we don't tend to see the big oil slicks that were a problem for seabirds throughout most of the last century, but there are still some sources of contaminants that can have detrimental impacts for seabirds. And some of our recommendations are about joining up particular bits of policy or approaches to try and further tackle those sort of problems. Next slide, please, Hank. So, yeah, hopefully I've shown how we dealt with the evidence and how we turned that into some pretty high-level recommendations. That gives us the pathway, and within the pathway we've got those 74 actions. So obviously the challenge then becomes how to start implementing some of those actions, and that's the subject of ongoing work that we're doing with DEFRA and with other stakeholders. But some of the potential routes to delivery might include things like protected site actions, so the way that we manage protected sites and the opportunities that might bring through things like protected site strategies, which are a power Natural England has in the Environment Act, might enable us to deliver some ESCARP aims. There's also stuff in the Environment Improvement Plan, specifically mentioning ESCARP, so there are some hooks there for delivery, and we also have statutory targets for species abundance and extinction risk, which also relate to seabirds, so there are definitely some drivers from the policy side. You mentioned marine net gain in your intro, Hank, that Audrey's going to give a presentation about, and that's obviously something on the horizon that could be really exciting and could directly link to some of the actions that we've identified for ESCARP. Also, we're all dealing with challenges of compensation for offshore wind and how we mitigate some of the impacts that seabirds can experience. So again, ESCARP does offer some opportunities there, we think, in terms of setting out how we bring about seabird recovery. And then the final couple of ones are about, firstly, how we respond to HPAI and trying to increase that resilience, particularly at breeding colonies, to ensure that any future outbreaks don't have the same effect that potentially they did last time round. And finally, things like Natural England Species Recovery Programme, which is a mechanism for bringing about species recovery through research and through directed actions at particular locations. So yeah, a flavour of, excuse me, how some of the actions from ESCARP might ultimately be delivered. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the last slide. Just to say, if you found it interesting, there's a blog that we wrote at the beginning of the year when the first report was published. If you just Google that, you should be able to find it. But that explains in a bit more detail what we did within the project. And then if you go to Natural England Access to Evidence and just put in Seabird, you should find the full technical report itself. It's quite long, it's about 450 pages or something, but there is also a technical summary if you haven't got that length of time. But yes, you can see in more detail what we did within the project, and specifically those 74 actions that we included under the 19 recommendations. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you, Alex. I just say I have read your blog. It was very good. I also glanced through the technical summary and an even lighter glance with a few deep dives into some of the technical annexes. So it's quite a comprehensive document. There's a huge amount of information in there, and I think we'll all agree that this is a huge piece of work, massive endeavor. So well done to you and the team, and thanks again, for giving us an update on all of that. At this point, I'd like to bring Francis into the conversation as well, and for the next 15 minutes, we've got an opportunity to ask Alex and Francis a few questions on this topic. Now, as we've been going through, there have been one or two questions I've just got here. So I'd like to kick us off, if we don't mind. This is a question for both of you, really. But if we start with you, Alex, as this relates to England, and you touched on it a little bit in your talk, it's around how the ESCARP, the actions within it, how you think those will relate to wider policies. You mentioned that in your last slide, but are the actions in the ESCARP, do you think those will be quite tightly linked to strategic compensation, to UK marine strategy in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Hank. I hope so is the short answer, I think. Because the ESCARP sets out a bit of a shopping list of actions effectively to bring about recovery, then we'd hope that they would be applicable into all sorts of different policy contexts. Obviously, every context has its own slight demands and slight nuances, but we certainly hope there's plenty in the ESCARP to link to. And I think specifically you mentioned strategic compensation. So we're trying to develop a piece of work to directly link ESCARP actions with compensation to show which of those actions might be suitable as compensatory measures, for example, and that by setting out that sort of comprehensive range of recommendations and actions, expand the scope of potential compensation options. And I noticed Kirsten Carter was on the call as well. RSPB are doing something similar, so evolving the LOC report that I mentioned, which was that big exercise to find out what are the problems at individual colonies, into something which again could translate into those more strategic compensation actions as well. So there's a sort of twin piece of work that Natural England and RSPB are doing at the same time, which we really hope will be able to work with DEFRA on to potentially unlock some of the actions as specifically as compensatory measures.
Great. I mean, it just seems like such a useful piece of work. It'd be great to see it marry up with some of these big policies out there. So that's great to hear. I've got a very similar question for you, Francis. I know you're involved with a lot of evidence gathering, synthesis, and then the provision of advice in Scotland. I'm curious then how the what efforts are progressing in Scotland in a similar vein to what's happening with the ESCARP, and then I suppose, is there scope for these to marry up in some way over time?
Yes, sure. I mean, so I'm not the equivalent to Alex in Scotland, so there'll be people in Scotland that understand this a little better than me. But from what I know, the Seabird conservation strategy, the Scottish Seabird conservation strategy, is well underway internally within Scottish government, and it's underpinned by the Scotland's biodiversity strategy, and it has much in common with what Alex described for England. I need to find out whether the same level of sort of background research on sensitivity of each species was done as the very comprehensive work that Natural England and colleagues have done. But certainly the list of threats is very similar: climate change, food availability, invasive predatory species, native predatory species, bycatch, renewables disease, pollution, habitat loss. So very unsurprisingly, of course. And again, some of the themes, the three main themes, again, have parallels: ensuring plentiful food supplies for successful breeding and survival, restoring and enhancing safe breeding and foraging habitats, and minimizing anthropogenic mortality. And from what I've started, Emma Phillip, who's seconded into Scottish Government, is leading that work, and it's due to go out to consultation later in the year, sort of October, November time. Of course, your question is a key one: is what happens with these recommendations and how do they align to policy mechanisms? I wouldn't be at all surprised that some of the same policies that Alex mentioned are right at the heart of this. That's strategic compensatory measures, marine net gain initiatives, marine enhancement. I know that north and south of the border, there is a slightly different approach being taken in terms of the link between those two, actually, and the extent to which marine net gain can be delivered through strategic compensation plus, so to speak, or whether it needs to operate as a separate set of initiatives. And of course, there's a whole lot of other sectors that need to be involved. So, for example, fisheries in the context of prey availability and bycatch questions. And there are also, I think, upcoming some very interesting issues that may arise in the next period in Scotland to do with conflicts with protected predators. So I'm particularly thinking of white-tailed eagles, and what's happened in Norway in the last decade or so, where there are colonies. There's a colony in northeast Norway about the size of the Isle of May in terms of birds that has had complete breeding failure of guillemots for several years in a row, because there are up to 30 immature white-tailed eagles working the cliffs throughout the season. So that's obviously a very challenging question, as the eagles have full protection, of course. So yeah, I think a lot of parallels and some differences. My understanding too is that, and Alex will know more about this, is that the discourse between Scotland and England is good, even if some of the approaches might prove to be somewhat different. And that's great, because of course we're dealing with mobile species that will be crossing these borders.
Yeah, some really interesting points that you raised there, Francis, and I'd like to come back to elements there that you alluded to, and it's that you're not working as Alex's counterpart in Scotland. You know, we know you to be a researcher in this space. You know, so I want to come back to the research in a moment, but I think in terms of that coordination, cooperation across the UK. It's really encouraging to hear of efforts going on in Scotland, and Alex, I'm curious as to the opportunities for bringing together some of the learnings, you know, that your team have, and whether that can be sort of infused and adopted. I know elsewhere, and you know, I do know some of the Scottish sensitivity assessments via FEAST, at least for seabed habitats. I know it's a slightly different system, but as Francis pointed out, a lot of the pressures are the same pressures. You know, and also there's the issue that seabirds, I'm sure they don't recognize borders. You know, they will fly wherever, right? So it'd be interesting, sort of opening up the policy discussion there. But Alex, to hear of where you think the opportunities are for communicating these great findings more widely, even across all of the North Sea, if we can go up to that level.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Thanks, Hank. Funny enough, I'm speaking with Emma Phillip that Francis mentioned in Scotland next week. So there's definitely that kind of cross-pollination, and I think also just to mention the role of JNCC in each of these strategies. So as the body which oversees nature conservation at the UK scale, then they obviously have a key role to play in ensuring that there's that kind of join up between what the individual countries are doing. So Kirsten Cobra at JNCC was really helpful on ESCARP, and I'm sure she'll be doing the same on the other strategies as well. So yeah, I think you know, in terms of the implementation, obviously that's all kind of still in the process of being worked out. We're working with DEFRA to get views on the ESCARP recommendations from stakeholders and partners this coming winter, and that I would imagine might well involve some of the, you know, cross-border counterparts that that will enable us to see where those potential opportunities for co-working might lie. I think, you know, we didn't really go into the knowledge actions that we identified within our strategy. I think some of those probably very naturally will happen at a UK scale anyway. So it's about, you know, the systems of monitoring and how they function and how they might be improved. And we're pretty good, I think, at the moment at working in that way anyway, through things like the Seabird Monitoring Programme and the National Seabird Census. So yeah, I'm sure there will be more opportunities emerging as the strategies across the different countries are finished, and as we kind of get stuck into more of the implementation of them.
All sounds great. I hope your meeting next week goes well.
Thanks.
We've got a question for you, Alex, from Bridget Finlayson, who's interested in all things about seabird bycatch mitigation, as a policy lead for DEFRA related to domestic bycatch. Is she correct in thinking that there are not currently effective mitigation techniques against seabird bycatch in high-risk fisheries, and how are these likely to be developed?
Okay, thanks, Hank. This is where I have the privilege of giving a slightly cop-out answer, because as I mentioned, the plan or the pathway rather was written across Natural England, including our fisheries specialists who are much closer to this area of work than I am. So I would probably not want to give an answer which might be incorrect, as it's slightly outside of my area of expertise. But we do know that in some fisheries, bycatch can be an issue. One of the issues we have is that it's very difficult to quantify the extent of that bycatch, and so part of the recommendations that we make are about how we might improve our understanding of where bycatch is happening and how frequently that is happening. So yeah, I probably will stop there in case I start straying into an area I'm not particularly expert within. Sorry.
That's good. It sounds like you're touching on it there. I'm just wondering, is this something you've been working on at all, Francis, or that you've got any thoughts you'd like to share?
I'm not an expert on bycatch either, I'm afraid. So I again, I don't want to say the same thing. I probably know some similar points Alex made. I know there are particular problems in particular places. I know they are concerned about fulmars off the west coast, which have declined, and not Scottish west coast, where they've declined very significantly, and their thinking is bycatch is a potential issue. I know that there's interest in bycatch questions beyond UK waters. I was at a talk at the Seabird Group conference in Coimbra a couple of weeks ago, where they were talking about whether alleviating bycatch of UK birds on migration off the Portuguese coast might work as a compensatory measure for a wind farm in UK waters. So this is very much an international question. That said, I think there's quite, again, I'm speaking to some of my bycatch colleagues, and very, very sadly, we lost one of our true experts this year in Simon Northridge. My understanding is there are quite a lot of challenges in fixing this problem. Otherwise, we would have fixed it already. But that's not to say it shouldn't be a serious focus, because, of course, it's absolutely should be top priority that we should be stopping any kind of mortality directly caused by us.
That sounds like a pressing issue that will continue to be worked on over the next while. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Bridget. I'm sure you'll be one of the experts in the field in no time. For the rest of our call, if we could just spend a minute or so to hear from each of you. Both of you are quite involved with research projects, and just like to take a quick opportunity, if you could tell us in a minute or so, just how you think some of the research you're doing and you're involved with can then interface with these initiatives, and then eventually lead to providing advice for some of the bigger policy challenges out there. If we could stay with Francis for a moment.
Yes, sure. I mean, we do research, as many of our colleagues do, in a lot of relevant areas in this space. And I think one of the distinctions that's useful to draw here in the context of conservation strategies are research on drivers that we can manage at the sorts of local scales that would work in this context, and whether that's fisheries or bycatch or invasive mammalian predators, these sorts of scale issues. And then the more sort of broader scale, harder to sort of fix type questions, in particular climate change. And so we work on both of those areas, and climate change, even if it's a challenging question for a conservation strategy, it still needs to be factored in and accounted for, because we have this shifting baseline. I guess the second thing I would say about that is we're often dealing with multiple drivers operating at once, and therefore we need to understand whether those are synergistic or not. And then probably the third thing I would say is that right now, and in particular the last 3 or 4 years, and we're doing a lot of research on this at the moment, that our UK waters are experiencing a series of shocks. And we're not in a simple situation of climate warming, or rather not simple, but sort of gradual situation of climate warming. We have a lot of extreme events, whether that's storm periods in winter. We had an extraordinary marine heat wave in 2023 that's really only now sort of coming to an end. So I think that makes it particularly important that research can help understand what that greater variability in our system will do, and whether it might even tip us into a new system, and what that means for species such as seabirds.
Sounds like there's plenty to do there. What about you, Alex?
Yeah, no, thanks, Hank. And I suppose building on Francis's point there about climate change, part of our research is focused on that mitigation hierarchy recommendation that I talked about, and particularly what we've set out in our Natural England's approach to offshore wind, which is thriving nature alongside low impact renewable energy. And we're working on a couple of big projects actually across the UK, although we're Natural England, for the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, which we hope will enable people to do a couple of things. So one of them is called Poseidon. It's a big data approach to risk mapping. So it's not just for seabirds, it's also for marine mammals and benthic habitats and communities, with the idea of being able to show the top 1, 5, 10% riskiest environmental areas in the UK EEZ, so that can inform marine spatial planning and the work that the Crown Estate and others do to work out where to lease offshore wind farms. So we can hope to get the avoid part of the mitigation hierarchy a bit more sorted out and a bit more embedded through that project. That's due to deliver next summer. And the other is called Rescue. So where we can't avoid impact, how can we mitigate it? Rescue is designed to use new technologies like LiDAR to understand and accurately measure seabird flight heights, so that we can design mitigation solutions based around hub heights, which are evidence driven and enable us to make cost benefit decisions about things like cost and energy production and environmental impact. So by developing these kind of solutions, we hope that will contribute to a more streamlined impact assessment, which actually enables us to avoid more of the impact than perhaps has been the case in the past. So yeah, just a flavour of a couple of the projects that we're leading. Will feed into the marine management decisions of the future. Yeah, hopefully that's the plan. Yep. Yeah, great. Well, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. So a big thanks to you, Alex, for talking to us today, and thank you to Francis for joining us. Apologies to everyone about the technical glitch at the start of the call. Still glad to hear what we have, and thank you to all of you for dialing in, for your time as well today, and our question. So just one more in the series. On the 15th of October is going to be Marine Net Gain. Hope to see you all there, and just to thank you all again, and wish you a pleasant afternoon. Thanks, Hank. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.